All right. Hey everybody, my name is Damon Knight and welcome as always to my channel. Today we're going to be continuing our series on a complete noob's guide to astrophotography. Do want to take a minute to say if you're just joining us for the first time, I strongly recommend you go back and watch the first video, which is all about how to figure out what type of astrophotography you are interested in doing. It's a really important question to answer up front because it can really influence what type of equipment you buy. I don't want you wasting money. Today, however, we are going to be talking about telescopes. Now, again, we're going to keep this very, very high level. There's a tremendous amount of detail that we could get into, but we're going to save that for when we get a little bit more advanced. Today, we're just going to talk about the types of telescopes, or at least the main types of telescopes that you're likely to run into, and we're going to cover a little bit of the language that folks use, some of the words that people use to talk about telescopes that you may not understand or know at first, and you'll have a much easier time with a kind of a basic primer. So we're going to start by talking about aperture. You're going to see this talked about a lot. The aperture of a telescope, really easy. It's just how big that opening is that lets all the light in. It's really easy. It's usually measured in inches or millimeters. I haven't really found a consistent reason why any company picks one or the other, but there you go. Next up, there is what's called focal length. Focal length is pretty easy. It is generally just, well, it's not even generally, it is just how much magnification you're getting. It's not put that way, it's measured in millimeters, but it's effectively, how far away can you see with that? Now, obviously, the further away you're looking, the narrower your view. So, a larger number is going to have a lot of magnification. You're going to see a much smaller section of the sky. Smaller number, bigger section of the sky. Pretty straightforward. And then the next big one is going to be the focal ratio. Now, this is a ratio that has to do with, the aperture and the focal length. The main thing that you need to know is a smaller number is what's called faster, a bigger number is what's called slower. And faster and slower basically just means how much light it collects at a time. And this is really important based on how bright or dim your object is that you're taking pictures of, right? If in the last video, I mentioned, right, planets are very, very bright. And as a result, you can get away with a very slow telescope. You can make that speed for focal length trade-off. Broadly speaking, right, the longer the focal length, the more magnification, the slower the telescope is generally going to be. If you're willing to throw money at it, you can get around some of that, but broadly speaking, that's the deal. If you have a very, very dim object, you probably want a faster telescope. Otherwise, you're going to spend a whole lot of time taking pictures and integrating, stacking to get the image that you want. But again, right, that's a trade-off, right? You can use a slow telescope on dim objects. You're just going to have to spend more time. So don't think that you can't use one for the other. There are some gotchas as well with super, super fast telescopes and specialized filters and things like that. But again, don't worry about that for now. So now that you have that very, very basic understanding of some of the terminology, we're going to get into some of the types of telescopes. I'm going to start out talking about reflector telescopes. Now, reflectors, like the name implies, use mirrors to reflect the light to a focal point and give you that magnification. Now, because they use mirrors, they tend to have very large apertures, which means that they generally tend to be big and bulky telescopes. But they're also pretty cheap. Mirrors are much easier to make, especially big mirrors, than complicated lens assemblies, so they tend to be a whole lot cheaper. That said, they can be a little bit fiddly, because there are multiple mirrors involved, you have to keep them aligned, and there is some fiddling to it, but because they're so cheap, it is a really, really common entry point into the hobby. Usually you will see what's called Newtonians and Dobsonians. And please get in the comments, tell me if I'm wrong in this, because I don't own a reflector. My understanding, though, is that a Dobsonian is basically just a Newtonian with a simple mount on it. Don't worry about what mounts are. We'll get to that in a future video, but they're functionally the same. You'll frequently see those referred to as newts and dobs. Just putting that out there so you know, if you see it in the community, you'll understand what people are talking about. They're most frequently used for planetary astrophotography, because they can be on the slower side because of the big focal length and the big aperture. Again, you're not limited. You're not stuck only doing planetary. If you have a Newtonian or a Dobsonian, but that is generally what they're used for. Because they tend to be slower, it's a little harder to use them for galaxies and nebula and all of that fun stuff. It is worth noting that some of those telescopes are set up specifically for visual astronomy and not for astrophotography. If you're not sure, you can look for things that say imaging Newtonian or astrograph or things like that, which usually means that they are suitable for astrophotography. Moving on next, we have refractors. Now this is how I got started, and this is probably what you think of when you think of a telescope, right? This uses lenses to bend the light. Think of it a whole lot like your camera lens. Functionally is the same thing, just different magnification amounts and potentially focal ratios. I'll show you one here. I've got a handy refractor telescope right here, just so you can see what that looks like firsthand. Again, right, it should look pretty much like what you expect. Now, refractors are much easier to use, and they tend to be a bit smaller in size. However, they also tend to be quite a bit more expensive than a reflector telescope would be. Because of their ease of use, I tend to recommend them more for new folks than I do for reflectors. But again, because of that cost difference, a ton of people go with reflectors first, and I think that is a completely reasonable choice. The other big challenge, obviously, with these is, I mentioned that they are more expensive, but that gets even worse the more magnification you want, the longer the focal length. They get really expensive. So when you're starting out, don't go for focal length. And honestly, I'll say that going back to just telescopes in general, when you're starting out, unless you're doing planetary, you don't want a huge amount of focal length. And in future videos we'll talk about what's a lot and what's a little and all of that fun stuff. You don't need to worry about that too much just yet. But they're great. They're used for all kinds of astrophotography, actually. They're frequently used for solar and lunar astrophotography. Lots of people just use their regular camera lenses when taking pictures of the moon. They're frequently used for wide field astrophotography. If you want to take pictures of huge chunks of the sky, you want to get pictures of the Milky Way, a refractor is probably what you want. You can get the higher focal lengths if you want to do some of the further nebula and galaxies, but again, it starts getting real expensive real quick. And that actually leads us into a third type. Again, just getting started, you don't need to worry about these. I would not recommend any of the telescopes from here on out for someone just getting started, but I want you to be aware of their existence so you don't get confused if you see people talking about them. And that is, God, and I'm so bad at saying this, catadioptric telescopes, which most people just call cats, and that's what I'm going to do going forward. And these actually use a combination of mirrors and lenses, and They're pretty cool, honestly. You know, you get a much longer focal length than you do from a traditional refractor for a much lower price point. That said, you do have the mirrors again, so you get some of that complication that you get from reflector telescopes. So it's all, you know, fun trade-offs, but again, if you're looking for focal length for not all of the money, those are a reasonable option that a lot of people do. Now, most people use them for planetary astrophotography. I use mine for galaxies and nebula, tend to be quite far away. But they're very flexible because of their design, and I'm personally a big fan of that. Now, you know, within cats, there are a variety of different types. You know, I use a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, most frequently referred to as an SCT. You don't need to worry about that. I'm just kind of making sure you're aware that it exists. There's Ritchie Crichtons or RCs. Again, you don't need to worry about that. And there's radio telescopes and all of those things, but you're not using those for traditional astrophotography. So, we've briefly kind of covered, right? There's the three main categories: reflectors, refractors, and cats. You know, reflectors have been around for forever. Right? Mirrors are easy. Refractors are a little bit newer, a little more complicated, but easier for you, the end user. Um, that's pretty much it for our super brief and high level overview of the different main types of telescopes and what they're generally used for. Again, it's just some of that vocabulary that is going to serve you well as we go. Next time, I'm going to start talking, I think, a little bit about cameras. We are going to revisit telescopes in more depth in the future, but I think we'll go into cameras a little bit next, just to keep things interesting. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next video.